At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George lay crouched inside the shattered remains of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. The bunker was little more than broken logs, sandbags, and mud, but it provided a narrow field of view into the coconut groves beyond. Through the scope of his rifle, George studied a banyan tree roughly 240 yards away. It was the same rifle his fellow officers had mocked for weeks, the same rifle his commanding officers had dismissed as impractical, the same rifle George had waited months to receive while others carried standard-issue weapons into combat. At 27 years old, John George was already an accomplished marksman. He had won the Illinois State Championship years earlier and was widely regarded as one of the best civilian rifle shots in the state. But in the U.S. Army on Guadalcanal, none of that seemed to matter. He had 0 confirmed kills and carried a bolt-action sporting rifle instead of the semi-automatic M1 AW and semi-disarmed 1 Garand used by nearly every other infantryman around him. The situation at Point Cruz was deteriorating quickly. Japanese snipers had taken advantage of the dense jungle west of the Matnikau River, operating from high in the massive banyan trees that dominated the area. Over the previous 72 hours, those snipers had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. The Japanese marksmen were patient, disciplined, and deadly. They struck from concealment, vanished, and struck again. George's rifle had become a source of ridicule almost from the moment it appeared. When he first unpacked his Winchester Model 70 at Camp Forest in Tennessee months earlier, the unit armorer had asked if he planned to hunt deer instead of fighting a war. His platoon leaders joked about it openly. His battalion commander referred to it as a toy. The rifle had not even made it overseas with George. It remained behind in an Illinois warehouse, while George sailed to the Pacific, watching other soldiers clean their Garands aboard ship. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, the rifle finally arrived. A supply sergeant handed George a wooden crate marked "Fragile." Inside was the weapon George had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay. Fully loaded, the rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds. The attached Lyman Alaskan scope added more weight, making it heavier than the standard-issue Garand, while offering fewer rounds and a slower rate of fire. It was a civilian hunting rifle in a war that increasingly valued volume of fire over precision. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the rifle behind and carry a proper service weapon. George ignored him. The 132nd Infantry had relieved exhausted Marine units on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had secured Henderson Field, but had failed to fully clear Japanese positions to the west. Mount Austin still stood heavily fortified, and Japanese troops continued to operate from the surrounding jungle. The battle for Mount Austin itself had been brutal. 16 days of fighting, dozens killed, hundreds wounded. George had participated in the assault, but he never fired his Winchester during that phase of the campaign. Point Cruz was different. There were no concrete bunkers or trench systems here, just jungle trees, and men who knew how to disappear into both. Japanese snipers had retreated into the groves and adapted quickly. They moved silently, climbed high before dawn, and waited all day for a single opportunity. On January 19th, one sniper shot and killed a corporal as he filled canteens at a creek. The next day, 2 more men were killed during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 additional soldiers died, including one who had been shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice, without noticing anything unusual. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing faster than malaria, and morale was collapsing. The commander wanted to know if George's mail-order rifle could actually do what George claimed it could do. George explained his background calmly. He spoke of his championship win of his long-range groups, of the hours spent refining trigger control and wind reading. He described what his rifle could do with optics instead of iron sights. The commander listened, skeptical but desperate. He gave George one chance. Prove it by morning. George returned to his tent and prepared his rifle. He cleaned away the last traces of shipping grease, checked the scope mounts, and loaded 5 rounds of standard .36 ammunition, the same cartridge used by the Garand. The rifle was ready. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into the captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves. He brought no spotter, no radio, just his rifle water and ammunition. He settled in and began watching the trees. At 9:17, something moved. At 9:17 a.m., George's eye caught what most men would have dismissed as nothing, just a tiny shift among tangled branches. The jungle canopy was always alive with noise and motion, but this was different. There was no wind, no reason for a thick banyan limb to twitch in a measured, deliberate way. Through the modest 2.5 power magnification of his Lyman Alaskan scope, he fixed on the disturbance and waited for it to repeat. A moment later, it did. 80-plus feet up the tree, partially hidden where multiple branches joined, was a human outline, dark clothing, still posture, and the unmistakable shape of a rifle. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching a trail the Americans used to move supplies and men. George did not rush. He adjusted his aim slightly for wind drift, steadied his breathing, and let the crosshairs settle into place. The Winchester's trigger had been tuned to a clean, precise break. Now in the steaming jungle of Guadalcanal, that refinement mattered. He pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked into his shoulder with a sharp crack that cut through the constant background of birds and insects. Far away, the figure jolted, then collapsed. The body dropped through the branches and fell the full height of the banyan, landing hard at the base, with a dull final thud. George worked the bolt immediately up, back, forward, down, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. His scope stayed on the trees. He knew the enemy's methods. Japanese snipers often operated in pairs, one shooter, one observer. Killing one rarely ended the threat. It only signaled the start of the counterhunt. For nearly half an hour, he scanned methodically. The limited magnification forced him to search slower than he wanted. Every shadow could be bark. Every dark patch could be vines or a man refusing to move. The canopy made deception easy. Still, George persisted, sweeping from left to right and then down the trunk line, studying angles and gaps. At 9:43, he found the second. This sniper was in another tree about 60 yards north of the first, lower in the branches, and moving along the trunk as if trying to withdraw. He had heard the shot. He understood what it meant. George tracked the motion, led the target slightly, and fired. The second Japanese soldier fell backward, his rifle clattering through leaves ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 confirmed kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip, his movements controlled and practiced. His hands didn't tremble. His breathing stayed even. It felt in technique like competitive shooting, except the consequences were no longer paper targets and scorecards. Then the duel became personal. At 11:21, a rifle round smashed into sandbags near George's head, close enough to spray grit into his face. The shot came from a different direction, southwest, and it was not random. Someone had found him, or at least had narrowed his location to the bunker. George froze, pressed into cover, and waited. In jungle fighting, rushing a response usually got you killed. He let minutes pass, listening, watching, and thinking the way he had been trained on ranges, yes, but also now through the hard logic of survival. The shooter would likely relocate after firing, yet thick jungle limited how far a man could shift without being spotted. At 11:38, George saw the mistake. In a cluster of banyans 70-plus feet up, the sniper had shifted branches, but remained in the same tree. That small change created a new silhouette, a slightly different shadow pattern, a barely visible shape that did not belong. George set the crosshairs, fired once, and the third sniper dropped out of view without a sound. By midday, George had accumulated 5 kills. The news spread quickly through the battalion because nothing travels faster in a combat unit than hope. Men who had laughed at his sporting rifle now wanted to follow him, watch him learn his method. George refused them. Curious spectators attracted attention, and attention drew bullets. He returned to scanning, but the Japanese adapted. After the 5th kill, movement in the trees nearly vanished. The sniper stopped shifting in daylight. The canopy turned still not because it was empty, but because the remaining enemy understood exactly what had betrayed the others. At 1600 hours, George pulled back to report. Captain Morris was waiting. The mocking tone was gone. Morris didn't lecture about real rifles anymore. Instead, he wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began under heavy tropical rain thick enough to limit visibility to under 100 yards. George remained in place and waited. Rain could hide movement, but it could also conceal a sniper climbing into a firing perch. That possibility worried him more than boredom ever could. At 8:15, the downpour eased. By 8:45, the groves became visible again through a curtain of lingering mist. At 9:12, George spotted the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed during the rain, smart timing masked by noise. He had also chosen a longer shot than the previous day, around 290 yards, likely hoping distance would reduce George's advantage. George adjusted for range and fired. The sniper fell. Then came the response George hadn't expected so quickly. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began dropping rounds around the bunker. The first impacts fell short. The next landed closer. Someone was walking the barrage forward, triangulating his position by sound muzzle flash or simple deduction. George understood what that meant. The next salvo would erase him. He grabbed his Winchester and ran. He sprinted north, cutting along the tree line, and threw himself into a shell crater just as the third mortar pattern slammed into the bunker's location. The position he had occupied seconds earlier vanished under explosions and flying debris. The enemy had moved from snipers to indirect fire. They were escalating, and the rules of the contest were changing. George crawled into a new hide behind a fallen tree about 120 yards from the destroyed bunker. The cover was crude but workable, offering both concealment and a partial view into the same grove. And the snipers came back. This was no longer target shooting. This was a hunt where both sides knew the other was lethal, and both sides were adjusting in real time. At 2:23 p.m., George claimed his 7th kill. At 3:41, he took an 8th, this one nearly 94 feet up hidden well, until changing sunlight made the outline stand out for a fraction of a second. After 9 hours in position, Morris called him back. George reported the numbers 8 confirmed snipers down over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, and only 4 misses. That night, George cleaned the rifle and thought through the arithmetic. Intelligence said there had been 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained, and the surviving 3 by definition were the most careful. George barely slept that night. He lay on his cot with the Winchester resting across his legs, replaying every movement from the previous 2 days. 8 enemy snipers were gone. But that did not mean the danger was diminishing. It meant the opposite. The remaining men were the most disciplined, the most patient, and now fully aware that an American officer with a scoped rifle was hunting them. They would not repeat the mistakes of their comrades. Rain began again shortly after 4:00 a.m., heavy enough to delay any dawn activity. George used the weather to his advantage. Instead of returning to the positions the Japanese already knew, he relocated before first light. He abandoned both the destroyed bunker and the fallen tree. This time he selected a cluster of large rocks about 70 yards south of his last firing position, an old Marine machine gun nest from earlier fighting. The rocks offered solid cover elevation and overlapping sight lines into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to fade. By 7:43 a.m., the downpour had softened to a drizzle. Visibility improved. The jungle resumed its familiar hum. George began glassing the trees again, slow and methodical, refusing to let urgency dictate his pace. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree roughly 190 yards away, much lower than expected, only about 40 feet off the ground. It was an unusual choice. Most snipers favored height for visibility. This man had chosen concealment instead. The overlapping palm fronds formed a natural hide that would be nearly invisible to someone scanning from ground level. But George was not scanning from ground level. From his elevated rock position, he could see down into the fronds, the faint outline of shoulders, the darker mass of a head. The sniper was real, and the shot was easy. Too easy. George paused with his finger on the trigger. Experience told him something was wrong. After 3 days of losses, the surviving Japanese snipers would not present themselves so simply. They would not choose a position vulnerable to elevated observation unless there was a purpose behind it. Bait. George lowered the rifle slightly and widened his search. If the palm tree sniper was intended to draw fire, then another shooter would be covering him positioned to watch for muzzle flash or movement from whoever took the shot. He searched every tree within 300 yards, forcing himself to remain patient. 11 minutes passed. At 8:28, he found the real threat. High in a massive banyan tree, about 80 yards northwest of the palm, nearly 90 feet up, was another Japanese sniper. This one was hidden expertly. Vines and branches obscured him from 3 directions. His line of sight was aimed not at George's current position, but at the fallen tree George had previously used. He was waiting for George to reappear, or to reveal himself by firing at the decoy. George understood the problem immediately. If he fired directly at the concealed sniper, the report would give away his position, allowing the enemy to move before George could chamber a second round. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the old location and begin searching for him. So George turned the trap back on its creators. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree and fired. The Japanese soldier jerked and fell through the fronds. Almost instantly, George swung the rifle toward the banyan. As expected, the hidden sniper reacted, turning toward the sound. That tiny movement was all George needed. He fired again before the man could fully reposition. 2 shots, 2 bodies falling. But now his position was fully exposed. George gathered his rifle and ammunition and moved immediately, running east along the rock line before dropping into a drainage ditch about 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. 6 seconds later, machine gun fire shredded the rocks he had occupied moments before. Bullets smashed stone and sent fragments flying. The firing lasted less than 20 seconds, but it was enough. The enemy had committed to the wrong position. George waited another minute, then relocated again, this time into a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. He settled in chest deep, resting the rifle on the rim. 10 snipers down, 1 left. The last sniper would not be careless. He had watched 10 men die. He knew George's rifle, his methods, and his likely positions. George scanned the trees carefully, but something felt off. The jungle canopy looked empty. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The final sniper was not in the trees. Movement caught his peripheral vision low close, about 60 yards south. A shape moving parallel to the tree line, crawling through ferns and undergrowth. The Japanese sniper was advancing on the ground using vegetation for cover and approaching George's last known position at the rocks. George did not move. The Winchester was already shouldered, but the rim of the crater blocked his shot. To engage, he would have to rise and expose himself. The sniper stopped at 9:52, studying the rocks, searching for signs of movement. George waited. Patience had kept him alive for 3 days. It would have to work again. At 9:58, the sniper resumed crawling 35 yards, then 30, then 25. He was tracking George's escape route from the earlier machine gun attack. He had learned. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and took up a firing position facing east toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. He was now only 38 yards from George's actual position with his back exposed. The shot was easy. Too easy. George hesitated again. No sniper this skilled would remain in such an exposed spot without support. George widened his awareness and scanned beyond the man in the rocks. At 10:06, he found the second figure 70 yards northwest behind a fallen log. Another Japanese soldier lay motionless, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch. This was not a lone hunter. This was a coordinated pair, possibly the final 2 snipers working together. George understood the math instantly. He could not fire twice fast enough to prevent return fire. The bolt-action rifle demanded a different solution. He sank deeper into the water. Only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He held the Winchester upright to keep water out of the barrel and waited. At 10:13, the man in the rock stood. After 10 minutes without movement, he assumed George had moved farther east. He signaled to his partner. Both men began advancing parallel to each other, conducting a sweep. They passed George's crater. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, silent and deliberate. He aimed at the closer soldier and fired. The man collapsed. George worked the bolt and swung to the second. The Japanese soldier was turning, rifle rising. George fired first. 11 snipers, 11 dead. But the fight was not over. George barely had time to register the final 2 kills before a new sound froze him in place. Voices. Japanese voices. Not whispers, not the careful movements of snipers, but the louder, more casual noise of multiple men moving through the jungle together. Infantry, a recovery party, or a patrol sent to investigate why none of their snipers were answering. George dropped back into the crater immediately. The water was cold and foul mud pressing against his uniform as he submerged, until only his eyes remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester vertical, protecting the barrel. The voices grew closer, branches, snapping gear clinking softly. There were several of them, at least 6 by the sound of it. They reached the first body, the one George had dropped near the rocks. The voices stopped. Conversation followed, tense and animated. Then they moved on to the second body. More voices, more urgency. George counted seconds, measuring distance by sound alone. At 10:28, the voices shifted direction, not back toward the tree line, toward him. They had found his tracks, boot prints pressed into wet mud leading from the rocks toward the crater. George had been meticulous about noise and movement, but footprints were harder to erase under rain-soaked conditions. He checked his rifle. 5 rounds in the magazine. No easy odds against multiple infantrymen armed with semi-automatic weapons. The voices closed in 30 yards, then 25. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of the crater and looked down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier toppled backward out of view. George worked the bolt underwater, rose just enough to engage again. 2 more soldiers rushed into sight. 2 shots. 2 bodies fell. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted. More men were converging. George climbed out of the crater on the far side and ran diving behind a fallen tree as rifle fire snapped through the air. Bullets struck the ground. The crater rimmed the log he hid behind. The Japanese were firing at sound and movement, not confirmed targets, but volume alone made staying put impossible. George scanned through his scope. 2 soldiers were advancing cautiously from the crater. He fired once. 1 dropped. The other dove for cover. More voices appeared behind him. He was being flanked. George made the only decision that kept him alive: break contact. He ran north, crashing through undergrowth vines, tearing at his boots, branches cutting his face. Rifle fire followed, but grew less accurate as distance increased. After 90 seconds of hard sprinting, he threw himself into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed into the earth and listened. No pursuit. The Japanese had regrouped around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water in the action. 2 rounds left. His ammunition pack was gone, abandoned near the flooded crater. He waited, then began moving again slowly, using terrain and cover, heading back toward American lines. At 11:13, he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself and was escorted through. He reported directly to Captain Morris and delivered a full account: 11 Japanese snipers eliminated over 4 days, 12 rounds fired during sniper engagements, 11 hits. Additional infantry contact afterward. Morris asked about ammunition. 2 rounds left. He asked about the rifle. Dirty, but functional. Morris ordered George to clean his weapon and stand down. The battalion was shifting east. Point Cruz was no longer a priority. Intelligence indicated the Japanese were withdrawing from Guadalcanal altogether. Later that afternoon, George was summoned again, this time to division headquarters. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, wanted to know one thing: could George teach others to do what he had done? George was honest. Yes, but only with time optics-equipped rifles and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry had resources. 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes left behind by the Marines. 40 men in the regiment had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry ordered George to form a sniper section. George agreed on one condition: he kept his Winchester. Training began January 27th. George assembled the men at an improvised range east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were good shots. In reality, none had experience killing from concealment. George started with fundamentals, breath control trigger, discipline, wind reading, and stability. He taught them to shoot from rocks, logs, sandbags, anything the jungle offered. After 3 days, 32 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a garand, providing security and observation. Roles rotated to prevent dependency. On February 1st, George led 4 teams west of the Matanikau River. The mission was not snipers anymore. It was clearing remaining Japanese infantry. The results were immediate. 23 enemy soldiers killed that day. No American casualties. Operations continued. By February 9th, the sniper section recorded 74 confirmed kills. Only verified bodies counted. The Japanese evacuation accelerated under pressure. On February 7th, near the Tanambogo River, George was shot in the shoulder. The bullet passed through muscle. Painful, but survivable. He was evacuated, and within days the campaign ended. Guadalcanal was secure. George's section had operated for 12 days. 74 kills. 0 friendly losses. But George's war was not over. George spent 2 weeks recovering in a field hospital near Henderson Field. The wound in his left shoulder healed cleanly, but doctors made it clear he was finished with front-line combat on Guadalcanal. By the time he was able to move freely again, the Japanese evacuation was complete. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found nothing but abandoned equipment and empty positions. The campaign that had consumed months of fighting was over. During his recovery, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced jungle officers for a new assignment classified high risk and far from the islands. The destination was Burma. George volunteered without hesitation. By March 1943, he was aboard a transport heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed carefully in the cargo hold, sealed against moisture. He did not yet know the nature of the mission, only that it involved long-range jungle operations behind Japanese lines. It was the kind of warfare where precision, patience, and self-reliance mattered more than firepower. George arrived in India in early April. There he was briefed on a new unit still forming, eventually designated the 307th Composite Unit Provisional. Though the men would become known by another name, Merrill's Marauders. Modeled after British Chindit forces, the unit would conduct deep penetration operations in northern Burma. No supply lines, no artillery, everything carried on foot or by pack mule. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. Officially, he was a rifle platoon leader. Unofficially, everyone knew why he was there. Burma required changes. Guadalcanal had allowed short operations with resupply. Burma meant weeks on foot under brutal conditions. George modified his rifle accordingly. He replaced the heavy Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver model, shaved ounces where possible, and adjusted his load. Even minor weight savings mattered when carrying 60 pounds of gear through mountains and jungle. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their objective was Myitkyina Airfield, strategically vital for supplying China. The approach route was considered impassable by the Japanese: steep terrain, thick jungle, no roads. The march was relentless. Disease claimed more men than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion thinned the ranks daily. George used his rifle sparingly. During 3 months of operations, he fired only 7 combat shots. Each was deliberate. Each was decisive. a Japanese officer directing troops at over 400 yards, a machine gun position pinning down a patrol, a sniper threatening a marauder flank. Shoot once, move immediately. The Winchester's report was distinctive, and George understood the danger of a second shot. By May, the Marauders reached Maitkina. The airfield fell on May 17th. The mission succeeded, but the cost was staggering. The unit that entered Burma, thousands strong, was reduced to a fraction of its strength, broken by disease and attrition. The Marauders were disbanded shortly afterward. George survived. His rifle survived. But the war had changed him. The kind of precision shooting that had defined Guadalcanal was rare in Burma. Most fighting happened at close range in ambushes measured in feet, not yards. George understood something fundamental during those months. The Winchester Model 70 was an extraordinary rifle, but modern warfare was shifting toward volume mobility and standardization. In June 1944, George was evacuated from Burma. He would not see combat again. Back in the United States, he was promoted and assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia. His role was now instructional training officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He passed on lessons learned the hard way: patience over haste observation, over aggression, discipline over bravado. The Winchester stayed with him, resting quietly in a footlocker. George left the Army in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to civilian life, studied at Princeton and Oxford, and later became a respected scholar of African politics. For decades, few people knew what he had done on Guadalcanal or in Burma, but George did write it down. In 1947, he compiled his experiences into a manuscript, technical, precise, and unemotional. Friends encouraged publication. He resisted, then relented. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, became a quiet classic, respected by historians and firearms experts alike for its clarity and honesty. George lived long enough to watch warfare evolve again, from bolt-action rifles to modern sniper systems, from informal marksmen to dedicated sniper schools. The lessons he learned became doctrine. John George died in 2009 at age 90. His Winchester Model 70 now rests in the National Firearms Museum. Most visitors pass by without noticing it. It looks like an ordinary hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved skill could outweigh doctrine. That patience could defeat numbers. That one man properly trained and trusted could change the outcome of a battlefield.